There's a question that no Zen master has ever been able to answer satisfactorily. What to do when life simply hasn't read the Buddhist sutras? Buddha lived in an era when the greatest urban chaos was a noisy market in Varanasi. He didn't have to deal with global pandemics, competitive economies, or wars that demanded decisions in seconds. His teachings worked perfectly in a world where you had time to sit under a tree and contemplate existence for a few weeks. The problem is that life presents situations that challenge any enlightenment manual. You may have mastered conscious breathing, but that doesn't help when your city is being devastated by a plague. You may have understood generosity, but applying that in an economy where everyone is trying not to go bankrupt, well, presents interesting contradictions. The inconvenient truth is that millennial wisdom sometimes encounters problems younger than itself, and when that happens, we discover that authentic Dharma isn't about applying fixed rules. It's about developing discernment, to know when to use the teachings, when to adapt them, and when to admit that that specific technique wasn't developed thinking about your particular problem. Because enlightenment includes knowing when to be flexible with enlightenment itself. If you've ever tried to maintain inner peace while everything was falling apart, or discovered that infinite generosity has practical limits, like this video, subscribe so you don't miss how ancestral wisdom works when it encounters situations that definitely weren't in the original Buddhist curriculum. Know that feeling of trying to stay calm when everything is falling apart? Well, in 1348, an English monk named Brother Marcus Present was about to discover the practical limits of mindfulness during what was basically a medieval zombie apocalypse. Marcus wasn't just any monk. He was one of those who took mindful meditation seriously, the type who could meditate for hours without moving, who practiced conscious breathing while chopping wood, and who believed that proper mental state could solve any problem. He had spent 15 years at St. Bede's Monastery in northern England, perfecting the art of being present in the moment, regardless of what that moment brought. The monastery was located in a peaceful rural region, surrounded by green fields and villages, where the biggest emergency of the last 10 years had been an argument about sheep invading the neighbor's garden. Marcus would wake before dawn, meditate, work in the gardens with total attention, copy manuscripts in contemplative silence, and sleep with the clear conscience of someone who had spent another day in perfect harmony with the universe. He had such a stable routine that he could identify what time it was just by the sound of birds, knew when each bell would ring, and could accurately predict at what moment Brother Benedict would start snoring in the cell next door. His life was a constant exercise of presence, observation without judgment, and acceptance of whatever arose in the present moment. What Marcus didn't expect is that whatever arose would include the bubonic plague arriving at the monastery door, along with desperate refugees, infected rats, and what the local inhabitants began to call, with worrying accuracy, the Black Death. Because it turns out that mindful meditation works very well when the present moment is peaceful, but gets more complicated when the present moment includes people dying at your door, supplies running out, and the growing sensation that maybe the world is ending very slowly, one village at a time. Marcus had studied all the texts about how to maintain mental balance during adversities. He had practiced acceptance of difficult circumstances through voluntary fasts and night vigils. He was prepared for any challenge that would test his faith or his meditative discipline. He just wasn't prepared for the challenge of maintaining mindfulness when neighbors started appearing at the monastery gate, with buboes the size of eggs, fevers that made people delirious in invented languages, and a disturbing tendency to die within days of the first symptoms. The plague arrived gradually, first in stories brought by merchants, then in increasingly desperate reports from priests of neighboring parishes, and finally in the form of entire families knocking at the gate, begging for shelter, medicine, or at least a decent place to die. And Marcus, faithful to his principles of mindful meditation, tried to receive each of these situations with total presence, conscious breathing, and acceptance without judgment of what was happening. After all, pain is part of the human condition. Suffering arises from attachment to expectations, and wisdom lies in remaining centered regardless of external circumstances. The problem is that external circumstances were getting quite difficult to accept with Zen serenity when they included people vomiting blood in the monastery courtyard, the smell of bodies being burned arriving with the wind, and the discovery that maybe that breathing technique that worked during discussions about sheep wasn't adequate for a pandemic that was killing a third of the European population. Marcus discovered that there's a considerable difference between meditating about impermanence theoretically and watching impermanence happen in real time in the form of neighbors who were talking to you last week and are now being piled in a common grave outside the monastery walls. The first family arrived on a rainy Tuesday, knocking at the gate with the urgency of those who have no more options. Marcus was precisely practicing walking meditation in the garden, observing each step with total attention, when he heard the desperate screams from outside the walls, a perfect interruption to test his 15 years of spiritual preparation. Following his principles of universal compassion, Marcus opened the gate and encountered something that no meditation manual had adequately covered. A man carrying his wife in his arms, she delirious with fever, while 2 children clung to his legs, all covered with wounds that seemed to have come directly from the most dramatic accounts of the apocalypse. Not exactly the type of visit you expect when you're trying to maintain inner peace. Marcus breathed deeply, centered himself in the present moment, and did what any compassionate monk would do. He opened the monastery doors, organized shelter in the infirmary, and began to apply all the teachings about how to respond to others' suffering with loving presence and detached care. It was a perfect opportunity to demonstrate that mindfulness works in any situation, no matter how disturbing. It worked very well for approximately 6 hours, long enough for Marcus to feel quite satisfied with his practical compassion. That's when the woman died screaming in a language no one could identify. The children began to develop the same symptoms, and Marcus discovered that maintaining equanimity in the face of death is considerably more difficult when death is happening in the corridor next to your cell, making sounds that shouldn't be physically possible, and apparently has no interest whatsoever in your 15 years of meditative preparation. But Marcus was persistent, a man who doesn't easily give up his spiritual principles just because reality is being inconvenient. He intensified his meditative practice, spent more time in contemplative prayer, and decided that this was exactly the type of test that ancient masters faced, an opportunity to demonstrate that true mindfulness transcends external circumstances, no matter how disturbing they may be. After all, if you can't meditate during an apocalypse, what kind of meditator are you? Really? 2 weeks later, there were 14 bodies buried behind the monastery, and 23 sick people occupying all available spaces. The garden where Marcus meditated was being used as an improvised cemetery. The library where he copied manuscripts had become an infirmary, and his daily routine of silent contemplation had been replaced by an agenda that included changing bloody sheets, comforting the dying, and discovering creative ways to explain to orphaned children why their parents had permanently stopped moving. Marcus tried to maintain the appropriate spiritual perspective. He reminded himself that suffering is inherent to existence, that attachment causes pain, and that wisdom consists of accepting reality without resistance. He continued practicing conscious breathing between one death and another, meditated while digging graves, and sought to find serenity in the midst of growing chaos. Because if you're going to have a Buddhist existential crisis, better that it be during a real medieval pandemic. The problem is that chaos was growing exponentially and didn't seem very interested in his spiritual insights. Entire families began arriving daily. The monastery's food supply, carefully planned to sustain 12 monks for a year, was feeding 50 desperate people for weeks. The medicinal herbs ran out. The space to bury the dead was rapidly running out. And Marcus began to realize that maybe there was a practical difference between accepting theoretical suffering and managing logistical suffering in real time. Because it turns out that universal compassion is a beautiful thing in theory, but in practice, universal compassion needs supplies, physical space, and human energy that, no matter how enlightened it may be, continues to be sadly finite. And when you're trying to care for more people than you can feed, using medicines you don't have, in spaces that don't accommodate so many people, mindful meditation begins to seem like a philosophical luxury you can't afford. It was in the 3rd week that Marcus had his first genuine Buddhist existential crisis. He was meditating at dawn, trying to maintain his daily practice, when he was interrupted by the unmistakable sound of someone dying in the cell next door. He breathed deeply, tried to maintain concentration, Accept the sound as part of the present experience without judgment. Applied mindfulness, exactly as the texts taught. 5 minutes. Later, another person began screaming in pain. Then someone else asking for water. Then a child crying. Then the sound of someone vomiting. And Marcus realized he was sitting there, eyes closed, trying to maintain inner peace while, literally, people were dying around him waiting for help he could be offering if he weren't so busy being spiritually centered. At that moment, Marcus discovered something that no meditation manual had mentioned, and that probably should be written in bold letters on the first page of any text about Buddhist compassion. Sometimes, being present in the moment means stopping meditating and starting to act. Who would have thought? Marcus had spent 15 years practicing acceptance of suffering. He had meditated on impermanence, studied texts about how to respond with compassion to life's difficulties, and genuinely believed he was prepared for any spiritual test the universe decided to apply. What he didn't expect is that the universe would have such a cruel sense of humor. The fourth week brought 26 new refugees, including an entire family that arrived already half dead, carrying what remained of their belongings in a cart pulled by a horse that looked more skeleton than animal. Marcus received them at the gate, breathed consciously, and tried to maintain his Buddhist perspective on the situation. Impermanence, he thought to himself. Everything is transitory, including apparently the monastery's capacity to function as a monastery. The problem is that everything is transitory included basic things for survival like food. The monastery's grain stock, originally calculated for 12 people for a year, was feeding more than 60 people for a month. The math wasn't complicated, but it also wasn't encouraging. They had supplies for 2 more weeks at most. After that, they would have to choose between mindful meditation and not dying of hunger. A choice that no Buddhist text had prepared Marcus to make. But he tried to maintain spiritual optimism. After all, material detachment is a fundamental principle of the Buddhist path. Maybe this was an opportunity to practice renunciation at deeper levels. Maybe hunger was just another aspect of the human condition to accept with serenity. Maybe the growing sensation of panic in his stomach was just another transitory emotion to observe without identifying with it. These philosophical reflections worked very well until Marcus discovered that 3 of the orphaned children had begun eating tree bark they found in the garden, not out of childish curiosity, but because they were hungry enough to think that oak bark could be nutritious if you chewed it long enough. At that moment, Marcus realized that maybe material detachment wasn't exactly applicable when the material in question was food, and the people depending on him weren't adult monks practicing voluntary fasting, but children trying not to die. It was also in the 4th week that Marcus discovered a practical limitation of universal compassion that no master had mentioned. He was spending so much time caring for others that he had completely stopped caring for himself, not by conscious spiritual choice, but because there simply wasn't time. He would wake before dawn to meditate, spend the entire day changing bandages, comforting the dying, organizing burials, and trying to distribute insufficient food among too many people. When he finally managed to lie down, he was too exhausted to sleep properly. The result was that Marcus, the man who had dedicated 15 years of his life to developing mental and physical balance, was transforming into a skeletal and somewhat neurotic version of himself. He had lost weight, developed dark circles that rivaled those of the patients themselves, and begun to have moments when he forgot what he was doing in the middle of a task. Not exactly the type of example of Buddhist serenity he expected to become. Worse still, Marcus began to realize that his capacity to maintain loving presence was diminishing proportionally to his physical exhaustion. It was difficult to respond to others suffering with genuine compassion when you yourself were operating on 3 hours of sleep and 1 meal a day. It was difficult to accept death with Zen serenity when you were beginning to suspect that maybe you were next in line. And it was especially difficult to maintain spiritual perspective about impermanence when the impermanence in question included your own mental sanity. It was on a particularly difficult morning, while burying 3 more bodies behind the monastery, that Marcus had a revelation that wasn't in any text he had studied. Maybe, he thought, digging with a shovel that was becoming too heavy for his trembling hands. Maybe true compassion includes having enough compassion for yourself to recognize when you can no longer help anyone. Maybe wisdom includes knowing when to stop trying to save everyone before you yourself need to be saved. It was a disturbing idea for someone who had dedicated his entire life to principles of self-denial and service to others. But while covering another grave with earth and trying not to think about how many more he would have to dig in the coming weeks, Marcus began to suspect that maybe there was a difference between wise compassion and imprudent martyrdom. And that maybe no one had explained this difference to him when he was learning to meditate peacefully in the garden of a monastery, where the biggest crisis was a brother snoring too loudly in the cell next door. The 5th week was when Marcus discovered that exists a limit to how much reality a person can consciously accept before consciousness itself begins to protest, and apparently that limit lies somewhere between burying 40 people and watching orphaned children fighting over pieces of moldy bread while you try to explain that attachment to food causes suffering. By this point, the monastery had become something completely different from what it was when everything began. The garden where Marcus used to practice walking meditation was covered with improvised graves. The library, where he spent hours copying manuscripts in contemplative silence, had become an overcrowded infirmary that smelled of vomit, sweat, and human despair. The chapel, where the monks gathered for morning prayers, now echoed with groans of pain and pleas from people who wanted to know why God was allowing this. Marcus tried to maintain his spiritual routine because without it, what would be left of him? He would wake before dawn to meditate, but his silent contemplation sessions now included background noises that varied between violent coughs, babies crying, and the occasional sound of someone dying 2 cells away. He tried to practice conscious breathing, but the air was so loaded with smoke from funeral pyres that each conscious breath included the smell of dead neighbors being cremated outside. Still, Marcus persisted. Because if you abandon your spiritual principles precisely when they are most needed, what kind of practitioner are you really? He continued reciting texts about compassion while distributing water to people who knew they would die before sunset. He continued practicing non-judgmental acceptance while cleaning blood vomit from sheets. He had no way to wash properly. He continued meditating on impermanence while counting bodies that accumulated faster than his ability to bury them. The problem is that impermanence, when you're in the middle of it, doesn't seem like a profound spiritual truth. It seems like a cruel joke told by someone who never had to explain to a 6-year-old child why her parents stopped moving and started smelling bad. It seems especially cruel when you realize that the impermanence you're observing so consciously includes basic things for sustaining human life, like hope, food, and your own mental sanity. It was on a particularly difficult afternoon that Marcus had what can only be described as his first authentic Buddhist faith crisis. He was trying to comfort a woman who had lost her 4 children in 2 weeks, applying all the teachings about how to respond to suffering with loving presence, when she looked him in the eyes and asked, with devastating simplicity, "Why? Are you trying to convince me this is normal?" Marcus opened his mouth to explain about suffering as part of the human condition, about attachment as the source of pain, about acceptance as the path to peace, but the words didn't come out, because suddenly he realized he was trying to apply Buddhist philosophy to a situation that wasn't philosophical. It was just horrible, and maybe there was a difference between accepting suffering inherent to existence and accepting suffering that could be avoided if people had enough food, adequate medicine, and a safe place to live. That night, Marcus tried to meditate as he always did. He sat in the traditional position, closed his eyes, and tried to focus on breathing. But instead of finding serenity, he found a question he couldn't stop asking. If mindfulness means being present in the moment, and the present moment is a humanitarian catastrophe happening at your door, what exactly is the appropriate Buddhist response? Continue meditating while people die, or stop meditating and try to do something practical to help? It was a question that none of his 15 years of study had prepared Marcus to answer. And while he sat there, listening to someone coughing blood in the cell next door and a child crying from hunger in the cell on the other side, Marcus began to suspect that maybe there was a fundamental flaw in his understanding of how to apply Buddhist wisdom to situations where Buddhist wisdom didn't seem wise at all. Because it turns out that accepting what cannot be changed presumes you know the difference between what can and cannot be changed. And Marcus was beginning to realize that maybe there were many more things that could be changed than he had imagined if he stopped trying to accept everything with Zen serenity and started questioning why the hell those people were dying when he had arms, legs, and 15 years of discipline that could be applied to something more useful than silent contemplation. The 6th week was when Marcus finally understood something that should be written in bold letters on the first page of any Buddhist manual, but that apparently all the masters had forgotten to mention. Mindfulness doesn't mean standing still observing chaos. It means being present enough to respond to chaos intelligently. Who would have thought that 15 years of meditation would lead to such a revolutionary discovery as, maybe I should do something? The revelation happened one morning when Marcus woke up and realized he had spent the entire night dreaming about to-do lists, not about spiritual enlightenment or profound insights about the nature of existence, about practical lists of things that needed to be done to keep people alive. Organizing shifts to care for the sick, finding sources of clean water, discovering where to get more food, establishing some kind of system to manage the chaos the monastery had become. It was a strange experience for someone who had spent 15 years cultivating detachment from worldly concerns, but as he got up and looked through his cell window at the improvised cemetery the garden had become, Marcus realized something important. Maybe worldly concerns weren't always spiritual distractions. Sometimes worldly concerns were exactly what the situation required. So Marcus did something that would have deeply shocked the contemplative monk he was 6 weeks before. Instead of sitting to meditate, he got up and began to organize. He divided the refugees into groups. He assigned responsibilities. He established schedules for food distribution, medical care, and cleaning of common spaces. He transformed chaos into system, not through Zen acceptance but through practical administration. The result was surprising. People stopped dying at an accelerated pace, not because the plague had magically disappeared, but because someone was finally organizing available resources intelligently instead of just accepting that everything was impermanent and hoping the universe would solve the problems by itself. Marcus discovered he could maintain conscious presence while organizing cleaning shifts. He could practice compassion while establishing food rationing. He could cultivate serenity while creating practical systems to deal with deaths, births, and everything in between. It turns out that mindfulness applied to real problems worked much better than mindfulness applied to emptiness. More importantly, Marcus realized there was a fundamental difference between accepting suffering that cannot be avoided and accepting suffering that exists because no one is doing anything to avoid it. The plague was inevitable. People dying of hunger while there was poorly distributed food was not. People dying of thirst while there was inadequately treated water was not. Social chaos, while no one was organizing anything, was not. In the following months, Marcus developed what can only be described as practical Buddhism. He meditated, but with specific objectives, like mental clarity, to make difficult decisions about distributing limited resources. He practiced compassion, but compassion that included saying no to people when necessary to protect the welfare of the larger group. He cultivated detachment, but detachment from specific results, not detachment from basic responsibility to try to help. The monastery survived, not because Marcus had found perfect Zen serenity, but because he had discovered that true Buddhist wisdom includes knowing when to stop contemplating the nature of suffering and start doing something practical to alleviate it. Who would have imagined that enlightenment would include learning to make to-do lists and establish cleaning schedules? When the plague finally passed, 2 years later, Marcus had become a very different type of monk. He still meditated daily, still studied Buddhist texts, still practiced all the principles he had learned during his 15 years of spiritual formation. But now, he applied all of this to real problems, in real situations, with real people who needed real help. He had discovered something that no meditation manual mentions, but that perhaps should be highlighted in bold on the first page. Mindfulness without action is just spiritual navel-gazing. Compassion without practical responsibility is just a beautiful feeling that doesn't help anyone. And acceptance without discernment between what can and cannot be changed is just passivity disguised as wisdom. Marcus never abandoned Buddhism. He just discovered that true Buddhism includes knowing when to meditate and when to act, when to accept and when to resist, when to cultivate serenity, and when to allow yourself to get appropriately irritated with situations that should irritate any minimally conscious person. It turns out that enlightenment doesn't mean being zen about everything. It means knowing when to be zen and when to roll up your sleeves and work. Marcus spent 2 years discovering that true mindfulness includes knowing when to stop meditating and start organizing basic sanitation systems. It worked. On the other side of Europe, a Venetian merchant was about to discover that total generosity in a competitive economy presents logistical challenges that no sutra had mentioned. Know that feeling of wanting to be a better person and deciding you're going to start by applying spiritual principles to real life. In 1455, a Venetian merchant named Isabella Donatuto was about to discover why most people keep spirituality and business in completely separate compartments of life. Isabella wasn't just any merchant. At 32, she had inherited a prosperous spice import business from her father, who had spent 40 years building commercial connections from Constantinople to Flanders. She had ships, warehouses, contracts with suppliers on 3 continents, and a solid reputation in Venetian mercantile circles. She was exactly the type of person you would expect to be completely absorbed in profits, margins, and strategies to defeat the competition. The problem is that Isabella had spent the last 2 years studying Buddhist texts brought by merchants who did business with the Orient, not out of academic interest, but because she was genuinely fascinated by the idea that maybe there was a way to live that didn't involve constant competition, obsessive accumulation, and the perpetual sensation that all other merchants were trying to steal her clients. Venice in 1455 wasn't exactly the ideal environment for spiritual experiments. It was a commercial republic operating at full steam, where financial success was measured publicly, where entire families rose or fell in the social hierarchy based on their business profits, and where generosity was seen as an admirable virtue, as long as it didn't interfere with profitability. It was a place where you could be charitable, as long as you were charitable with the money left over after ensuring you would continue to be rich. Isabella, however, had encountered teachings about Dana, the Buddhist principle of generosity, and been intrigued by the idea that true giving shouldn't have calculated limits. According to the texts she had studied, authentic generosity meant giving without expectation of return, giving until you felt you had given too much, giving especially when giving hurt a little. It was a beautiful, inspiring philosophy and completely incompatible with any economic system ever invented by human beings. But Isabella was determined. She had spent years seeing how commercial competition transformed decent people into calculating and paranoid versions of themselves. She had observed how obsession with profit made merchants treat employees as costs to be minimized and customers as sources of money to be exploited. She was tired of a world where every human interaction was analyzed through the lens of financial advantage. So Isabella decided to do something no Venetian merchant had tried before. She was going to apply Buddhist principles of generosity to her business. She was going to demonstrate that it was possible to be financially successful while practicing genuine giving, universal compassion, and detachment from material results. She was going to prove that spirituality and commerce could work together harmoniously. It was an ambitious, noble plan, and so naive that it made anyone familiar with basic economics want to warn Isabella about some inconvenient realities she apparently hadn't considered. But Isabella was confident. She had studied the texts, understood the principles, and was ready to revolutionize Venetian commerce through unlimited generosity. What Isabella hadn't considered is that unlimited generosity and sustainable business might be mutually exclusive concepts, and that the universe has a very peculiar way of testing the sincerity of your spiritual convictions through situations that make you question whether you really believe what you think you believe. Isabella started slowly, testing the waters of Buddhist generosity with the caution of someone who still had some sense of financial self-preservation. She decided she would give a 10% discount to customers who seemed to need it, donate 5% of monthly profits to local orphanages, and treat her employees with salaries slightly above market average. It was calculated generosity, the kind that makes you feel good about yourself without risking bankruptcy in the first month. It worked well for a few weeks. Isabella felt spiritually elevated, the employees were happy, customers liked the discounts, and she was still profiting enough to keep the business running. It was perfect proof that Buddhism and commerce could coexist harmoniously, as long as you applied generosity with sensible moderation. The problem started when Isabella read more texts about true dana. According to the scriptures, authentic generosity shouldn't be calculated or limited by practical considerations. It should be spontaneous, abundant, and especially generous when it hurt a little to give. Real dana meant giving until you felt a knot in your stomach. Giving when there wasn't enough left over. Giving, especially when the voice of financial prudence was screaming for you to stop. Isabella looked at her account books and realized something disturbing. She was being too strategic. She was giving only what she could afford to give, maintaining a comfortable safety margin, calculating each donation so it wouldn't significantly impact her financial situation. This wasn't Buddhist generosity. It was controlled charity, planned philanthropy, the capitalist version of doing good without compromising profit. So Isabella decided to raise the level. She started giving bigger discounts, especially to families who seemed to be going through difficulties. She donated 10%, then 15% of monthly profits. She raised employee salaries again. She began offering interest-free credit to customers who seemed to need it. She began offering interest-free credit to customers who appeared to be going through financial difficulties. She started giving away products to families who couldn't afford them but clearly needed them. Isabella also began evaluating requests for help more carefully, not through cynicism or distrust, but through practical discernment about where her help could make the most difference. She discovered she could help more people by being strategic about how she distributed resources than by being indiscriminately generous with anyone who showed up with a sad story. More importantly, Isabella realized there was a fundamental difference between Buddhist detachment and practical negligence. Detachment meant not being emotionally attached to specific results, not completely ignoring the consequences of her actions. She could practice generosity without attachment to results, but still be responsible about how that generosity affected other people. In the following months, Isabella developed what can only be described as responsible business Buddhism. She continued practicing generosity, but generosity that took long-term sustainability into account. She continued helping people in need, but help that didn't compromise her ability to continue helping in the future. She continued applying spiritual principles to business, but principles that included practical responsibility as an essential spiritual component. The business stabilized, not because Isabella had abandoned her Buddhist ideals, but because she had discovered that authentic Buddhist ideals include practical wisdom about how to apply compassion sustainably. It turns out the universe really does provide, but usually through people who make intelligent choices about how to use the resources they have available. Isabella never abandoned generosity. She just discovered that wise generosity sometimes means saying no to individual requests in order to say yes to larger responsibilities, and that true dana includes having enough compassion for herself and the people who depend on her, not to practice generosity in a way that harms everyone in the long run. It was a lesson that probably should be highlighted in any text about applying spirituality to practical responsibilities. Compassion without discernment isn't compassion. It's just an expensive way to learn about how the world really works. Isabella spent 2 years discovering that unlimited generosity and sustainable economics might be mutually exclusive concepts, but that practical discernment is a form of compassion. In Germany, a blacksmith was about to discover that infinite patience and war don't consult each other before creating conflicting schedules. Know that feeling of discovering a perfect life philosophy and deciding to apply it exactly when life decides to test whether you really believe what you think you believe. In 1347, a German blacksmith named Wilhelm Geduldung was about to discover that Buddhist patience and military urgency operate on completely incompatible timelines. Wilhelm wasn't just any blacksmith. At 45, he had inherited a prosperous forge in the city of Nuremberg, specializing in weapons, tools, and metalwork that required technical precision and attention to detail. He was known in the region for the quality of his work, the reliability of his deadlines, and the ability to produce equipment that lasted decades without need for significant repairs. The problem is that Wilhelm had spent the last 3 years studying Buddhist texts brought by merchants who did business with the Orient, not out of academic interest, but because he was genuinely tired of living in constant urgency, waking up early, working until late, always running to meet deadlines, always stressed about delayed orders, always feeling there wasn't enough time to do anything with the quality he really wanted to achieve. Nuremberg in 1347 wasn't exactly the ideal environment for experiments with Zen patients. It was a commercial city operating at full steam, where contracts had specific deadlines, where clients expected punctual deliveries, and where delay meant losing business to competitors who could deliver on promised time. It was a place where you could be contemplative, as long as your contemplation didn't interfere with productivity. Wilhelm, however, had encountered teachings about Kanti, the Buddhist principle of patience, and been fascinated by the idea that maybe there was a way to work that didn't involve constant rush, perpetual stress, and the sensation that each project was a race against time. According to the texts he had studied, true patience meant working without artificial urgency, allowing each task to take the time necessary to be done correctly, trusting that quality results were more important than production speed. It was an attractive philosophy for someone who had spent 20 years running to meet increasingly tight deadlines. Wilhelm was tired of producing rushed work, of cutting corners to save time, of delivering products that worked, but could have been much better if he had had more time to refine them. He wanted to work with the patience of a craftsman, not with the urgency of a production machine. So Wilhelm decided to do something no Nuremberg blacksmith had tried before. He was going to apply Buddhist principles of patience to his work. He was going to demonstrate that it was possible to produce superior quality work, operating without rush, without stress, without the artificial urgency that seemed to dominate all other businesses in the city. He was going to prove that patience and technical excellence could coexist harmoniously. It was a noble, sensible plan, and completely disconnected from some realities about how wars work and why people who are trying not to die in battle tend to have specific opinions about when they want to receive the weapons they ordered. But Wilhelm was confident. He had studied the texts, understood the principles, and was ready to revolutionize metallurgy through unlimited patience. What Wilhelm hadn't considered is that taking the time necessary to do everything perfectly and delivering military equipment before the war ends might be conflicting objectives, and that the universe has a peculiar way of testing the sincerity of your spiritual convictions through situations where Zen patience meets mortal impatience. Wilhelm began implementing Buddhist patience gradually, testing what it would be like to work without the constant urgency that had dominated his professional life for 2 decades. He decided he would no longer rush to meet deadlines, would no longer do rushed work, and would allow each project to take the time necessary to be executed with technical perfection. It was patience applied with sensible moderation. It worked well in the first weeks. Wilhelm felt more relaxed, the work was coming out with superior quality, and clients seemed satisfied with the results, even when deliveries were delayed a few days. It was perfect proof that patience and technical excellence could coexist, as long as you applied Kanti with practical good sense. The problem started when Wilhelm read more texts about true patience. According to the scriptures, authentic Kanti shouldn't be limited by practical considerations or external pressures. It should be unconditional, unshakable, and especially strong when external circumstances tried to force you to act with haste. Real patience meant maintaining serenity even when other people were impatient, even when deadlines seemed urgent, even when social pressure suggested you should accelerate the work. Wilhelm looked at his schedule and realized something disturbing. He was still being too strategic about when to apply patience. He was being patient only with projects that allowed deadline flexibility, maintaining rush for orders that really needed to be delivered quickly. This wasn't Buddhist patience. It was controlled time management, an optimized version of doing things without compromising critical schedules. So Wilhelm decided to raise the level. He began applying patience to all projects, regardless of requested deadlines. When a client asked for a sword to be delivered in 2 weeks, Wilhelm explained he would make the best possible sword, and it would be ready when it was ready. When someone needed agricultural tools before harvest, Wilhelm worked at the speed that allowed maximum quality, trusting that patience would be rewarded with superior results. For a few months it worked. Not perfectly. Some clients got irritated with delays, but the quality of work was indisputably superior. Wilhelm felt he was on the right path, applying spiritual principles to technical work. It was challenging but not impossible. Maybe it was possible to revolutionize metallurgy through unlimited patience, as long as you educated clients about the advantages of not being in a hurry. That's when Wilhelm met Captain Friedrich von Steinberg, a military commander who had heard about the exceptional quality of weapons produced by Wilhelm. He arrived at the forge with a specific order: armor and weapons for 50 soldiers to be delivered in 6 weeks, because there was a war starting and soldiers without adequate equipment tend to die quickly in combat. Wilhelm listened to the explanation and made an observation that completely changed the captain's perspective on what it means to hire a Zen blacksmith. "Captain," said Wilhelm, "I will make the best equipment I have ever produced. Each piece will be worked with care and total attention. It will be ready when it's ready, and I guarantee it will be superior to anything you have ever seen." Friedrich explained, with patience he didn't know he possessed, that soldiers without armor die. That war doesn't wait for equipment to be perfected, that there were military schedules that weren't flexible because the enemy wouldn't consult Wilhelm's agenda before attacking. Wilhelm responded that haste was the enemy of quality, that patience created superior results, and that confidence in the process was more important than anxiety about artificial schedules. What Wilhelm hadn't considered is that artificial schedules and not dying in war are concepts related in ways that no Buddhist text had adequately explained, and that applying Zen patience to situations where people literally die waiting might not be the most appropriate application of spiritual principles about not being in a hurry. But Wilhelm was determined. He had understood the teachings, mastered the principles, and was ready to discover if infinite patience really created infinitely superior results. It was a philosophical experiment that was about to collide with some military realities that apparently no sutra had considered relevant for discussion. 3 weeks after accepting Captain Friedrich's order, Wilhelm was working with exemplary Zen patience on armor that would be, when finished, indisputably the most perfect piece he had ever produced. Each detail was being worked with total attention, each joint was being adjusted with millimetric precision, each piece of metal was being polished until achieving technical perfection. It was work that would take approximately 10 weeks to be properly completed. The problem is that the war had started 2 weeks earlier. Not that Wilhelm knew this immediately, because he was practicing detachment from external concerns and total concentration on present work. He had stopped paying attention to news, rumors, or anything that could distract him from the conscious application of Kanti to the metallurgy process. The first indication that maybe there were some urgent issues related to the equipment Wilhelm was producing with Buddhist patience came in the form of a sweaty messenger who arrived at the forge running and shouting something about soldiers dying without adequate armor. Wilhelm heard the message, breathed consciously, and explained that haste was counterproductive, that quality required time, and that interruptions disturbed the meditative flow necessary for excellent technical work. The messenger tried to explain that soldiers were literally dying in battle. Wilhelm responded that death was part of the human condition, that excessive attachment to specific results caused suffering, and that he was creating armor that would protect soldiers much better if made correctly than if made hastily. It was a spiritually elevated perspective that didn't change the fact that people were dying, waiting for equipment he had promised to deliver 6 weeks earlier. The visits became more frequent. Captain Friedrich appeared personally, explaining that the military situation was deteriorating rapidly. Other officers came with reports about casualties that could have been avoided if soldiers had adequate armor. Soldiers' families appeared begging Wilhelm to accelerate the work because their sons and husbands were on the front lines with inadequate equipment. Wilhelm tried to respond to each situation with genuine compassion, explaining Buddhist principles about patience, quality, and confidence in the process. But each explanation sounded more inadequate in the face of the reality that known people were dying, while he refined technical details that maybe weren't as important as he had imagined. The situation became more complicated when Wilhelm discovered that other blacksmiths in the region had accepted similar orders and delivered functional equipment, even if not technically perfect, within requested deadlines. These blacksmiths were working with urgency, making concessions in quality to meet military schedules, producing armor that protected soldiers adequately even without achieving absolute technical perfection. Wilhelm tried to maintain spiritual perspective on the situation, Maybe those blacksmiths were sacrificing quality for speed, producing inferior work because of external pressures. Maybe he was doing the right work, creating superior equipment that would serve better in the long run, even if it took longer to be completed. But there was a difference between superior long-term work and dead short-term soldiers. And Wilhelm was beginning to realize that maybe this difference was more significant than Buddhist texts had suggested. It was on a particularly difficult afternoon, after receiving news that 12 known soldiers had died in a battle where adequate armor could have made a difference, that Wilhelm had his first genuine doubt about whether he was applying Buddhist patience appropriately or had completely lost notion of practical priorities, because there was a difference between wise patience and insensitivity disguised as spiritual virtue. And Wilhelm was beginning to suspect that maybe he had crossed that line without realizing it. The war wasn't waiting for him to achieve enlightenment through meditative metallurgy. The war was happening now, with real people dying, while he polished details that probably didn't matter as much as he had thought. 2 months after accepting the order that should have been delivered in 6 weeks, Wilhelm finally finished the first complete armor. It was without doubt the most technically perfect piece he had ever created. Each detail was impeccable, each joint worked with mechanical precision, each surface had been worked until achieving a standard of excellence that surpassed anything produced in the region. It was art applied to military metallurgy. The problem is that the soldier for whom the armor had been made was dead for 3 weeks. Not that Wilhelm knew this immediately, because he was still practicing detachment from results and concentration on process. But when Captain Friedrich came to inspect the finished work, he brought news that changed Wilhelm's entire perspective on what it means to apply spiritual principles to urgent responsibilities. The soldier who would have worn that perfect armor had died in battle the previous month. Not because he was careless, not because he was unlucky, but because he was fighting with inadequate protection while waiting for equipment that Wilhelm was perfecting with Buddhist patience. The armor that could have saved his life was sitting in Wilhelm's forge, technically superior to anything ever produced in the region, and completely useless to someone who was already buried. Wilhelm looked at the perfect armor and realized something that no Buddhist text had mentioned, and that probably should be written in bold letters on the first page of any manual about applying spirituality to practical responsibilities. Sometimes good enough on time is infinitely superior to perfect too late. Who would have thought that enlightenment would include learning about deadlines and practical priorities? That night, Wilhelm had what can only be described as his first authentic crisis of Buddhist faith. He tried to meditate as he always did, but instead of finding serenity, he found a question he couldn't stop asking. If patience means allowing things to take the time they need, and the time they need is longer than the time people have to stay alive, what exactly is the appropriate Buddhist response? Continue working with perfect patience while people die waiting, or recognize that maybe the situation requires a different approach? It was a question that none of his 3 years of study had prepared Wilhelm to answer. And while he sat there looking at perfect armor that would never protect anyone, Wilhelm began to suspect that maybe there was a fundamental flaw in his understanding of how to apply Buddhist wisdom to situations where Buddhist wisdom needed to be balanced with practical urgency, because it turns out that accepting what cannot be changed presumes you know the difference between what can and cannot be changed. And Wilhelm was beginning to realize that maybe there were many more things that could be changed than he had imagined if he stopped trying to perfect everything with Zen serenity and started questioning whether maybe the situation required speed more than perfection. Wilhelm spent the following days completely re-evaluating his understanding of how to apply Buddhist principles to urgent responsibilities. Maybe true Khanti didn't mean working without haste in all situations. Maybe it meant discernment about when to apply patience and when to recognize that specific circumstances required speed, even if that meant accepting technical imperfection. He began working differently. He didn't abandon patience completely, but applied patience selectively to aspects of work where it really mattered. Basic structures that determined whether armor would protect adequately received careful attention. Decorative details that didn't affect functionality were drastically simplified. It was strategically applied patience, not indiscriminately applied patience. Wilhelm also began considering the larger context of his work. He wasn't producing art pieces to be admired in museums. He was producing protective equipment for people who risked their lives in combat. The primary function was to keep soldiers alive, not to demonstrate technical excellence. Beauty and perfection were secondary to practical utility. More importantly, Wilhelm realized there was a fundamental difference between Buddhist patience and practical indifference. Patience meant not being emotionally disturbed by external pressures, not completely ignoring the legitimate urgency of situations where speed really mattered. He could maintain mental serenity while working quickly when the situation demanded speed. In the following months, Wilhelm developed what can only be described as responsible war Buddhism. He continued applying principles of patience, but patience that took the practical context of work into account. He continued seeking quality, but quality defined by functional effectiveness, not abstract technical perfection. He continued practicing Khanti, but Khanti that included discernment about when to be patient and when to act with appropriate urgency. The work accelerated significantly, not because Wilhelm had abandoned his Buddhist ideals, but because he had discovered that authentic Buddhist ideals include practical wisdom about how to apply patience in a way that actually benefits the people who depend on your work. It turns out that true patience sometimes means working quickly when people need results now. Wilhelm never abandoned Khanti. He just discovered that wise patience includes knowing when to be patient and when to recognize that the situation requires speed, and that inappropriately applied patience can be a form of cruelty disguised as spiritual virtue. It was a lesson that probably should be highlighted in any text about applying spirituality to urgent responsibilities. Timing is an essential component of compassion. Patience at the wrong time can cause as much suffering as impatience at the right time. When the war finally ended, 6 months later, Wilhelm had delivered functional equipment that protected soldiers adequately. It wasn't technically perfect, but it was effective when it was needed. And living soldiers wearing imperfect armor was an infinitely superior result to dead soldiers waiting for perfect armor. It turns out that Buddha never had to deal with bubonic plague, competitive economy, or military schedules. His teachings worked perfectly in a world where you had time to contemplate existence without anyone dying waiting. The problem with millennial wisdom is that it was developed in contexts that didn't include the complications of real life. When you try to apply perfect philosophy to imperfect situations, you discover there's a difference between understanding spiritual principles and knowing when to apply them appropriately. The discovery that any serious person about spirituality eventually needs to make is simple. Authentic wisdom isn't about mechanically applying spiritual rules. It's about developing discernment about when to apply which principles and when to recognize that the situation requires a completely different approach. Real Buddhism includes knowing when to be Buddhist and when to be practical. Enlightenment doesn't mean being Zen about everything. It means knowing when to be Zen, when to get appropriately irritated, when to accept and when to act. If you've ever tried to apply spiritual teachings to real life and discovered interesting contradictions like this video, subscribe to the channel for more discoveries about how ancestral wisdom works in unforeseen situations. Turn on notifications, and in the comments, tell us what other spiritual teachings you'd like to see tested in real practice. Good night, and may your own experiments with millennial wisdom be less disastrous than those of the people you just met.